Welcome to Messy Liberation,
This is our special Everything is Political series.
where we're going to help you draw the connections between your everyday life and the world around you.
Let's get started.
Thank you for joining us today. We've got a guest, part of our Everything is Political series. So I'm just going to ask Sarah if you could just introduce yourself and what you do, and then we'll get into it.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here. My name is Sarah Heeter. I run a podcast production and strategic consultation company called PodFox Media. And this is such a cool conversation to me because my educational background is all in politics and public policy and diplomacy. I actually dreamed of working for the State Department before I realized interning there that if you work for the State Department, it's not about what you think is good for the people involved. It's about representing the interests of each administration that turns over regularly. And I was like, oh, that changes how I feel about this job. So obviously, like so many of us, I wound up going a direction that had nothing to do with my education at face value, which is entrepreneurship. And when I started my company, part of my resistance to wanting to do it, even though I had experience with marketing and operations, is that I felt like I didn't feel like my purpose on this earth was to do podcasting. Like that didn't feel like it went together. And so I really built this company on the basis, the mission, the core values of amplifying underrepresented voices and the amazing work and expertise and lived experiences going on in our communities and in a variety of industries, leveraging a platform like podcasting. That's actually what I love about it. But of course, it's messy. So thank you for having me, and just excited to dive in.
Yeah, no, you were, when we were thinking about what different areas we wanted to discuss on this series, and Becky was like, obviously podcasting, because we have a podcast, right? I was like, oh, we have to have Sarah, because I remember last year you did a series of conversations and you had like multiple people come in, and I was able to participate in some of those, and they
And
were,
Becky too.
yeah, and they were really good conversations around different topics that were relevant to, this day and age and everything that's happening. So thank you for saying yes. We have a question that we want to open with, and then we'll just see where the conversation takes us. So with your I feel like this question is kind of irrelevant now after you gave us like your history, your background and education, all of that. But at what point did you realize that the podcasting space was a political space?
Yeah, that's a deep question. And I think, at face value, I want to say because of my background, like you all say, and hence the series, I think I came into entrepreneurship with a level of understanding that everything is political. But I think where it really hit me the first time of the immensity of responsibility in producing podcasts and helping people build platforms is the realization and almost fear of what do I do with how do I plan for if I'm helping somebody build a platform that actually actively causes harm? Like, what do I do with that? And how do I protect myself? How do I keep that from happening? How do I even know whether something is causing harm, right? All the messy stuff. And this is, you referred to, my podcast is called Big Brave Business. And so we talk about all of this too, right? Like the intersection of the big, brave conversations about what it means to do business, kind of the business specific version of what y'all are doing here. And yeah, I think those are the questions, right? Like I can have my core values and I can have my beliefs and I can try to hire and run a team and et cetera, like based on that. But what do I do with like a paying customer and what they are doing with that platform? So I think that's where it really first hit me. And of course, that only scratches the surface of how podcasting is political, but it is a big part of it because the medium is so intimate. I always say it mimics the intimacy of a phone call. It's dialogue based, right? And that's what makes it different from like YouTube or a newsletter is that this is a dialogue. This is the social part, right? And so even the person listening is engaging in this dialogue. You'll hear people make comments about listening to a podcast and hitting pause so that they can respond out loud because they feel like they're part of the conversation, right? This is not an uncommon phenomenon among podcast listeners. And so the power of that is so huge for those of us who want to amplify the work we're doing to reach people and especially to leverage it as a business resource. There's so much opportunity in that, but there's also no level of fact checking, like even which it still pains me to call it X. Even X has a level of, for better or for worse, fact checking, right? But on podcasts, you can literally just show up and say anything, and there are no methods of verification for that, let alone it could still be not necessarily about what's true and what's not, but again, what causes harm, what you use that platform for. Amplifying voices means amplifying all voices, and that's quickly a slippery slope, right?
Did you have a personal experience that brought that sort of to the forefront for you? You don't have to name names, obviously, but
Yeah, no, that's a
did you
great
have a client experience or somebody who wanted to be a client where you were like, no, I don't know. This is now starting to bring up these questions about my contribution to this harm.
Yes, I did. I had a client who I liked, but I had ideas about ways that we approached the current state of affairs. And of course, this was 6.5 years ago, but still applies differently. And the podcast had nothing to do at face value with politics. Now, of course, like everything is political, but at face value, it wasn't a political podcast. But what I noticed is that he shared on social media that he was hosting a campaign party for a local candidate who was very opposite of my personal views and the way that I would want to approach things. And it occurred to me, man, I knew I had a feeling about this individual and I having opposing political beliefs, but what do I do with this as the lines get muddier? What if he says something about this campaign party? Do I cut it out? I mean, I'm editing the show. I get to decide, right? And so like that's where I started to think, "Oh, I need to have contractual things that address these issues so that I can have a transparent conversation with clients up front before we ever even enter a paying agreement, before there is a platform about where my lines and boundaries are, what my best practices are, and at what point I determine we are no longer compatible to work together effective immediately. Like, what does that mean, right? And so yes, there was a specific. And then since then, there have been a smattering of people who have maybe come to me wanting to specifically start political podcasts. And we just let them know, like, this is what we believe as far as amplifying voices and how important this medium is and how important it stays indie and grassroots. But also, PodFox does not produce inherently political podcasts where like your goal is to talk about what's going on in politics. We do not produce those. That's like just way too complicated as to what we're putting our name on. But I mean, I would say my podcast itself, it personally is very political. So I mean, but it's mostly about entrepreneurship. And it's not necessarily about like candidates, if that makes sense. And so that's where, and also I get to control what I say. I mean, like it's mine. So it's a little different. But yeah, it's complicated. So we have actually turned people away before who have come to us for that. Just saying, not that we think you should or shouldn't have a podcast, but we're not producing it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not the right fit. It's not
Yeah.
values aligned. Yeah.
Or it's just too much responsibility to put on
Yeah.
my shoulders as to what my role is. I don't know what you're going to say at what point. And
Mm,
that's just setting all of us up for a world of complication.
yeah. 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 I'm curious, and I don't know if you will be able to answer this question, but like when I think about the podcasting space as being political, right? Like the first place my mind goes to is like access, like who has access to the resources and the tools and the audience and the networks to like run a successful podcast. What has been your experience with that in producing, a variety of different podcasts for different types of people, whether, race, class, gender, et cetera? Like, what does
Yeah.
that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's the first place my mind went to when we first talked about this topic offline, right? Well, I guess technically we were still online. You get the point. Not recording is that the opportunity for, the barrier to entry for podcasting is extremely low. Yes, you do have to have internet access, but at this point, more people around the world have access to the bare minimum equipment and internet access opportunity that they need, the resources for even hosting podcasts, etc. It's been made more accessible today than it's ever been. And it's an opportunity to reach a global audience with long form content that is voice to voice to ear, right? That is unparalleled, right? Like YouTube. It's revolutionary in that way. And I think especially podcasting. Again, the difference there being that YouTube is a one-sided conversation. It's very voyeuristic. Like, I'm here talking at you, or you get a glimpse behind the scenes at my life, but it's one way. Whereas podcasting is a dialogue, it's a conversation. And so it feels, neural pathways wise, what's going on in your brain is actually like a two-sided conversation. And so the power of that is so incredible because before that was way less accessible to people. Now, that being said, of course, yes, you're right. We can take that accessibility conversation further and look at the fact that the largest podcasts, if you look at like the top performing charting podcasts, the top earners, and this is where my brain next goes, right? Is where's the money? Is heteronormative, cisgender, white men.
Joe
So I looked
Rogan.
up statistics on this. There's a lot of research out there. So I looked up a ton of different sources to try to get as close as I could to like a real answer. And of course, it depends on the cross section that you're looking at. But for people making more than $75,000 a year, which is like pretty much you make nothing or you make more than that, right? So it's like, is your podcast fully monetized? 70% of earners making at least $75K a year from a podcast are men, and about 80% of podcasters making $75K or more a year are white. And again, this is a cross section of NPR, Statista, Edison, Sounds Profitable, a bunch of different like reputable research institutions, and so that really shows you like who has not just reach, already has established platforms that's going to make transitioning to podcasting easier, but also who's getting the monetary deals, who's getting those multi-million Spotify deals, right? And so like disproportionately, that's going to certain demographics of people. And so although anybody, quote unquote, and that's not exactly true because you do have to have access to internet and some equipment, et cetera, but almost anybody can start a podcast. But who can truly profit most from a podcast? The money's going specifically to these same demographics that we talk about in a lot of different circumstances, right? And then that takes me to this further step that I'm just going to open the can of worms of. What do they do with that money once they get it? That's also like a whole other layer. It's not just who stands to get paid, but what do they do with that money and that platform once they have it? So I'll pause there.
Because I obviously, so I run the Feminist Podcasters Collective. Podcast is a part of that, and it's all designed similarly with your business. Although we're not a production company, a collaborative of people who are trying to amplify the voices of marginalized folks in this space. And we're all independent podcasters, meaning we don't have like iHeartMedia or Spotify or one of these major companies bankrolling us, right? We're all doing this out of pocket. And there's like the group of people who are getting 20, 50, 100 downloads, right? That's the norm. And then there's the Joe Rogans and the, Amy Poehler's and the Dak Shepherds and whoever who are, getting tons of downloads, whatever. And it's easy for small independent podcasters because you're, like you said, almost anyone can start a podcast. You go to the library, they have podcast studios that you can get for
Mhm.
free. There's very little real expense, and there's even ways to put out most of it for free. Like there's just very little you have to do. So this wonderful medium that's supposed to be all about democratizing media, right, making it accessible to all, is lovely, except that there's still gatekeepers, right? Who's deciding what content is actually seen? Because when there are, and I'm sure you know the stats, Sarah, but as many podcasts as there are, and there are a lot, although a lot of them are dormant. They're not actually live podcasts, people putting out episodes. But even with those that are putting out episodes, it's still, it's immeasurable, it feels like, the amount of content that's out there. So you can't just open up a file and find a million podcasts and figure it out. Someone does have to help you make sense of it all, right? So we understand why we have gatekeepers, people who are saying, you can't look at a million files. We'll help you sort of organize these files and find things that are good for you. And yet, who's making those decisions, and how does that affect what's being served up and what we see and then what we're missing, right? And for those of us who are independent, small voices, it feels nearly impossible to get seen, right? And so I'm just curious, like, what do you know about that part of the business, of the gatekeeping piece? Because,
Yeah.
right, anyone can do it, but I don't think the reason Joe Rogan's at the top is because Joe Rogan is necessarily the best or even what most people would want, but he's darn easy to find.
Agreed. I think part of that has to do with the money that's bankrolling the visibility of that podcast for sure at this point. But also he was a comedian before he was ever a podcaster, right? And this is an interesting thing because I do want to touch on like celebrities, but the truth is Joe Rogan really was not a very huge celebrity before starting his podcast. He's been podcasting for so long that if you know him, it's predominantly because of his podcast.
Mhm.
Got into podcasting before the celebrity boom. So we lump him in with celebrities because he's the highest earning podcaster, right? But also he did get there before the celebrity podcast boom happened. I think that what's really interesting, and this is also another layer of like not only how podcasting affects politics, which I do want to get to, but how politics and what's going on in public affairs affects podcasting.
Mhm.
In 20, we saw this huge rise of podcasting. Now, a lot of reasons why, but a big part of it is that all of these performers, all these SAG actors were not working. And in order to keep their benefits, they needed to have jobs. Now, that became a huge monetary opportunity to push celebrities like actors, etc., performers to start podcasts that are highly monetized. And so these huge media companies like iHeartRadio had a massive incentive to now encourage and incentivize the celebrities that they're working with to come and do podcasts so that there's a huge amount of reach, there's a huge amount of advertising opportunity. Everybody's making money in that
Mhm.
sense, right? Except indie podcasters. And there's such a blend of, yay, now everybody knows about podcasting, so there's an opportunity for me to reach more people. But prior to 2020, it was almost purely indie, right? And so if you did open an Apple Podcasts or any of those other podcasting apps that were really popular back then, many of which are not around even today, when
Mhm.
you go into those podcasts, they were almost all indie creators. Now, again, some of those indie creators could now be considered celebrities, right? But that is where that was the only thing that was really available in there because there weren't that many people listening. So 2020 really caused this, like, and with COVID and quarantine, and the shutting down of all of these other industries really caused this huge shift of pushing celebrities into podcasting that brought so much money to the field. And so the industry itself of podcasting is very torn on this. It brought more money into podcasting. Advertisers see more value in the power of podcasting, the intimacy that you create with listeners. More than half of people who listen to podcasts have bought something they've heard from a host read podcast ad.
Mhm.
That's incredible compared to less than 1% of a click through rate on most other internet based advertising. The opportunity for advertisers is huge. So that brought a lot of money into the industry. However, where's the money going? It's predominantly going to the actors who don't even need it, who got brought in.
And my favorite is on their podcast when they love to talk about how we're not even making anything. And, oh, this isn't even, it's laughable how little money this is. And then you're you're an independent podcaster going like, your laughable little bit of money would probably
Yeah,
be life changing for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So there's like read the room stuff there too, which is
Yeah.
fascinating.
absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, personally, I have so much trouble listening to celebrity podcasts, even of celebrities I generally like, because of exactly that. It really, and this is kind of, I want to bring this back to politics, but this is really kind of what I think is so funny about the power of podcasting with the intimacy of a phone call. It makes you really feel like you know the people who you're listening to, like you have, especially the average podcast is 25 to 45 minutes long. It comes out once a week. So how many people in your life do you have a 25 to 45-minute phone call with every single week? That
Yeah.
number is slim to none, right? So to be able to achieve that level of intimacy, the know, like, and trust is incredible. But what that shows us is you also can't hide who you actually are. So these celebrities who show up week to week, like they're really showing that. Was it like Mariah Carey, who's famous for saying she didn't know that she had to pay for electricity in an interview? So I feel like that level of disconnect of celebrities, that's what I feel like when I listen to a celebrity podcast. To me, that's all I can hear
Yeah.
is
Or the way that people have went from loving Dax Shepard to realizing what,
What a tool he is.
yeah. And just like, yeah, because they reveal themselves and it's,
Yeah.
and that the privilege shows up in all of its ways, whether it's
Yeah.
his, the male privilege, the white privilege, the
The
class
class
privilege.
privilege.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, those things show up and it puts a spotlight on it and
There's
his sour side.
another layer to this too, and that's elections. So we saw in 2024 an unprecedented, or a new precedent, I guess I should say, or even in the general election for having our major party presidential candidates both appearing on podcasts. And that was part of the strategy. And this is interesting because it has the same opportunity and also effect. We saw both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were on multiple podcasts. Donald Trump did more. His podcasts that he was on had generally larger reach, and they were predominantly male skewed, talking about things like public affairs. Kamala Harris went on also large podcasts, but not as big of reach, also
Mhm.
predominantly women skewed and predominantly pop culture oriented, which is very interesting.
Mhm.
Now, what is fascinating by that is we get an opportunity to have access to candidates in a way that we don't have. And so just like radio and television revolutionized campaigning, right? Now we have podcasts revolutionizing campaigning. Now local candidates have an opportunity to have reach to their electorate that they never had before. And candidates at all levels of government, right, have opportunity to reach, and they can't be everywhere at once. Town halls are so limited in how much time you get to actually speak directly with your constituents. Debates are going to be a completely different environment and atmosphere, and TV appearances are very short and very structured. So, this is an opportunity to really feel like we get a phone call with our major party candidates. That's a whole new level of access to them. And it's scary.
It is.
And they can
I
have their
saw
own podcast. Gavin Newsom is showing, we know
Yeah.
he's wanting to run for president, and the way he's showing up and who he's platforming, but it shows us, again, it's just the microphone in ways we've never seen. And as you mentioned earlier, there's no fact checking, which we saw with what Donald Trump did with Joe Rogan's show, Theo Von's show, showing up, spouting lies, no one to fact check, no one to correct. These are not journalists. Some people are
some
journalists.
people are journalists,
Yeah,
yeah, but
to be
not
clear.
all,
But
yeah.
no, I mean, Joe Rogan, we have a lot of former comedians, a lot of actors, a lot of,
And us.
and there's
We're
And
nothing.
not
us, yeah,
journalists.
we're not
Well, I am,
journalists.
just to be clear, I have two
Well,
journalism
Becky was a
degrees.
journalist. Becky's a journalist.
Yes, but I understand. But and I have no problem with non-journalists showing up and getting, like, I think it's fantastic. The whole point is to give everyone a voice. But what it does do is it leaves podcasting in this really murky, strange space where we're not subject to equal time laws, equal time rules from the FCC. We're not governed by the FCC in that way. And as we're seeing play out, or when this airs, it has already been playing out, but where this is showing up with Stephen Colbert. Now suddenly the government's trying to say, oh, no, we do want these equal time laws to translate not beyond just newspapers or news shows, but into cultural, pop culture shows. What will that mean for podcasting? What does that mean about who's getting platformed? How, and what that means to podcasters and responsibility. So there's a lot there too, just about like who you choose to have on your show,
Mhm.
what you choose to correct or not correct, either
Yeah.
live or later in show notes. And then does anyone see it? So yeah, there's just a lot of stuff there that's really interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's everything is a double. I know I've used this phrase so many times, but it's double-edged, right? Because all the things I love about podcasting, the opportunity for building this deep sense of connection, part of the reason why so many people have purchased from host-read ads is because the amount of trust that is built between a podcast host and the person listening is immense. It's a huge thought leadership opportunity. You're establishing yourself as an expert at what you do. I hosted a podcast for over 6 years that was for Girl Scout troop leaders, trying to help them feel prepared and supported equitably, right? Because some people sign up for that role and they have a ton of support and resources, and some it's crickets and they're doing it alone in a vacuum. So I wanted to help try to close the gap. Podcasting is a beautiful space to do something like that, right? And so all these things that are so powerful, I just shared that. You may know nothing about Girl Scouts, but just the fact that I hosted the podcast for 6 years, you're like, oh, she's probably an expert about Girl Scouts, right? And so I think that, the opportunity to build trust is so cool for those of us who do have thought leadership to share. And that power, with great power comes great
Great
responsibility,
responsibility.
right? Because then the people who are listening are inherently more likely just to trust what they hear. I heard this on a podcast. It's now an equitable or a verified source, right? Which is why I tried to say, I'm going to throw some statistics, but let me also tell you where these statistics came from. Because if you listen to another podcast, you're going to hear somebody else throw out random numbers. And if they don't give you a source, you don't have any way of knowing which one of us is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I know there has been at least one instance that I can think of where Becky and I were considering having a guest, and I was just like, "Oh, I know someone." Like, I had a previous client who was in the same kind of space, and I was like, "Hey, do you know this person?" Just to kind of, like, quickly vet And they're like, yeah, they're actually really harmful. And so I was like, okay, maybe not the best choice to have on the podcast, right? To talk, because I feel like when you bring people into that, it's like bringing people into your home. Like, you have to be really careful about who you're having those conversations with, because that is giving permission to and validating, what those people represent, what their values are, and whatnot. How do you have those kinds of conversations with your clients in terms of managing their expectations? What are the expectations that they need to have? How to vet guests? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah. Okay. So this is about the responsibility of who you have on your show and how you know. Yeah. Okay. So one thing is talking about, are you even going to have guests? Because you don't have to. And you all have done, guest episodes and not, right? And so you make that decision. And then, yeah, are you personally inviting people, or are you going through an application process, and we review the application process together of what do they want to screen for? What is important to them? Core values is so fundamental to everything that we do at PodFox, and so that's also how we consult on shows. And so, what are the core values that you want to ensure? Ooh, I am apparently disconnected.
No, you're
You're
still
back.
just keep going. She can't hear us. Can you hear us?
Let me
Can
know
you
when you
hear us?
guys can hear me.
We can.
We
Can
can
you
hear
hear us?
you.
Can you hear us?
This is weird because it says I have internet. Not sure what to do.
I'm gonna text her.
Okay. Now she seems frozen. Oh no, there she is. Oh, I wonder if she can see the chat.
You can hear and see me. That's weird. Okay. Well, that's good. Okay, I can't hear you, but I will just finish my answer and then maybe it'll rectify itself. So everything we do is really rooted with core values. And so that's also how we consult, right? And so what are your core values and what is important to you, and how are we making sure to filter for that? And then what do we do when something goes wrong? And so helping people really navigate that. I think that, it's been interesting to help people through that. It is something that comes up for pretty much everyone, which is at some point an interview doesn't go the way you hoped it would, or you've already aired an interview and then something happens where you find out that somebody is no longer actually a core values aligned fit that you thought they were, that you thought you filtered for. Related, they also will run into this with sponsors. And so this is something that when you do move into like monetization of podcasting, and we also talk about, I think it's really important to make sure there's really tight limitations on how long a sponsorship contract is for. So we will like recommend, don't do it for more than 3 months, or do it for 1 month and it's renewable, right? That way, if you realize that sponsor is not a good core values fit, same kind of thing as a guest, you're able to like end that partnership right away.
Can you hear us yet?
You're still frozen for me though, so I
No.
can't hear you.
Hold on.
I can text her questions.
Well, I'm gonna see if she wants to exit out and come back in.
Yeah, I can try that. I don't want to lose what we recorded though. I saw your thing about it takes time to upload. Here, I'll close it and come back and hopefully we'll see what happens.
At least it's not my end.
Yeah.
It's been me in the past. Technical issues.
So speaking of unhinged podcast guests, RFK Jr. was on a podcast the other day. This was on the news where he said he used to do cocaine off toilet seats.
Oh, gross. That's just gross.
Hi.
Can you hear us now?
What? Cocaine on toilets?
RFK Jr.
RFK Jr. on a podcast said that.
Well, I wanted to. I think a lot of what we've talked about here is the industry. And I think most of our listeners are probably some probably are consumers. And if we
Yeah.
have listeners who are also creators of podcasts, more than likely, unless Amy Poehler happens to listen to us, which I doubt, it's all like little independent folks as well. And so I wonder, as an independent, I think some of what we talked about is as a consumer of podcasts, it's helpful to think about. And then if you're a creator of podcasts, thinking about how you show up and how the choices that you're making, even at this small, I have 40 downloads and I have a guest on, or I do solo episodes, but just thinking about how you are showing up inside of this political system and what choices you make and how those may be political. I'm just wondering if you think about that at that smaller independent producer or independent creator of podcasts, what are the things we should be thinking about? Obviously talking about guests, the kinds of guests we're having on and thinking about who they are and have we really checked out what they have to say. But there are other things that we could be thinking about in the ways that we show up and how that's political.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that probably is true for how we show up in all ways, right? Like leading, I think a big thing for me is like leading with curiosity. This is something that shows up a lot on my own show, is always trying to come at things with wanting to be open and learn and not assuming that I already know the answer. And especially as a white woman, I think that's like a huge responsibility for me as somebody who has a platform, right? My podcast is ranked in the top 2% of podcasts in the world. And, there's a responsibility that comes with that. And so I think, that's a big thing is like always leading with curiosity. And then, yeah, I think that trying to know better, do better. And then also, this is really where I'm so passionate about podcasting, right? And why I even have the company that I do, because there is an opportunity for us to share and amplify the immense knowledge and lived experience that doesn't typically have the opportunity to be broadcast to the world. And so we get to use a platform like podcasting, and especially when you can partner with an expert, either for just resources support like the collective or through like partnering with a production company like PodFox, that we can really help amplify those voices and those lived experiences. I think that the opportunity there is exciting and amazing. And that's really what podcasting was built for, right? Is this indie grassroots opportunity. And so I think that's still true and that's still there. And yeah, the opportunity is great. But what's coming up for you?
Well, that was, I'm glad you said it because it was really, it was like I was trying to make you say that. But yeah, because how often do we see these podcasts, especially from white women, but also white men? Yeah, white men too. But where it's like all the guests look like the host,
Mhm.
right? And when we know that the podcasts that are most likely to get through the gatekeepers and get the most attention are going to be those from celebrities that have money, that are probably going to be hosted by people with, of privilege. If you're not thinking about these things, then all you do is continue to perpetuate that problem by by platforming only more people who have that same experience. And so, and even if we're at a smaller level of this, we still need to be thinking about it. Who am I bringing on? And is there somebody else that could talk about the same thing? Is there another voice? And I will hear from people, well, I don't know those people, or they don't reach out to me. And I want to just remind people, like, yeah, sometimes you actually have to do work. Like, that's what they call it, doing the work. Sometimes you have to do work. You have to go out and seek out these voices. You might have to research. You might have to ask people who they know. You might have to just like do that scary thing of reaching out to somebody you don't know and asking them to be on your show. We can't get complacent and sit around and just wait for the right people to show up. And then if they don't, blame it on that. We are part of the system. And if we want to make change, we actually have to actively create change. And I think the same goes for listeners, to not just trust what is being delivered to you on the platter from Apple or wherever you listen to your podcast.
Mhm.
But to do a little searching, to do a little digging, ask other people, what are the shows hosted by Black women that I should be listening to, right? Going and actually doing some searching of some names that you might know that are, Black women that are doing amazing things, and see what shows they've been on. It might open some doors for you to find some new content that you might not otherwise experience, and then tell people about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is where I think things like the Feminist Podcasters Collective is so valuable, because these are the kinds of opportunities that you can like plug into to be in community with other indie creators, and not just who the platform is like feeding you. And I think similarly, like this is where we really get to leverage SEO to amplify each other. And I think that, podcasting has like just ridiculously poor SEO, but we can leverage things like blogs and our websites and other, kind of library-based websites that like Podchaser and things that talk about podcasts. You could make lists there on Podchaser, for example, that's specifically about podcasting, right? It's so if you don't know what it is, it's just like a website where you can explore and find podcasts to listen to and learn more about the shows and the hosts. Same with Listen Notes, right? That's another place you can like find podcasts. And so on a platform like Podchaser, even just building out lists of like independent creators, because then that's going to improve the SEO. You can also do this on blogs, things like that, or look for blogs where other people have already done this, where you're just Googling top podcasters that are X demographic, right? Or whatever, so that you can try to find, more Black women podcasting and more Indigenous voices and more, right? And so really exploring voices that the algorithm's not feeding you in the podcast apps. And then it learns your listener behavior as well. So if you're really being aware of who you're listening to, of what podcasts you're consuming, those recommendations or shows like this or whatever that are at the bottom of your screen, those are going to get more diverse because it knows your listening behavior. So being
Mhm.
really intentional about what you consume is going to help you be exposed to more ideas. And I think if you are a creator, that's also going to give you ideas for people to bring on, but also it's going to help you get out of that echo chamber so that your creation does not continue to just perpetuate the same things that are already being said everywhere else.
Yeah. 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 In terms of listener stats and engagement, across your portfolio, do you see a disparity in terms of who is getting the most downloads or the most listens or the most engagement, et cetera? And then how do you
Yeah.
have that conversation with clients?
Yeah, with the people that we specifically work with, I think we have a pretty good idea when they come to us of what those numbers are going to look like at this point. I've worked at podcasting for 10 years. I started my business 6.5 years ago. So I've worked with enough podcasters to know at this point. And honestly, with the way that we help indie creators, it's more about what level of platform you're already coming to us with. So, what's your
Mm,
email list size? What's your social media reach? What is the level of community you're sharing that podcast with in order to kick it off? And that's going to determine more about downloads. For the most part, most of our podcasts are performing, I would say, in a range of from probably pretty consistently a few hundred to 10,000 downloads a month. That's a very common, and that sounds like a big range, but really in the grand scheme of podcasting, that's kind of where indie creators sit, right? Is somewhere in there versus the hundreds of millions of downloads that Joe Rogan's getting, right? And so I think that discrepancy is nominal, but I think that we can have a pretty good idea when people come to us of what their platform already is. And if they're starting from zero, what it's going to take in order for us to help them build that platform to get to that same range. Now, that being said, people do come expecting numbers like TikTok. I could have a TikTok go viral and get 100,000 views, right? That's not going to happen with your podcast. It's just not. And so that is kind of a hard conversation. But what I always try to remind people is that, it's very low engagement to watch a 17-second TikTok or a minute long TikTok to listen to a 45-minute in-depth podcast episode connection. And so,
yeah.
even if you want to think about giving a keynote address, if I was speaking to a room that had 50 people in it from a stage, then I would be feeling like I made it, right? This is a really cool opportunity. And by the same token, usually those people didn't come to that keynote address or whatever, even if you're not necessarily the keynote, you're just speaking on a stage during the day. They didn't come for you. They came for an overall event. If they come to your podcast, they came specifically for you. If I just decided I'm going to give a talk, can I get 50 people to show up and be there live? I
Well, and
mean,
even more to come every week.
yes,
Yeah.
and to
It's
come
not like
every
they're
week
just
is
coming
even
once.
more
They're coming, yeah,
powerful.
I mean,
Yes.
think about that. They're coming, they want to see you every week. That's amazing.
Yeah. So really trying to change the way you're thinking about it of instead of just trying to get somebody to hit follow, which is what you're trying to do on Instagram or TikTok, right? Instead of trying to just get followers, which is such a low level engagement, and then you're fighting an uphill battle to create a relationship with that person. You have a relationship with somebody by the time they're done the first episode, let alone if they come back week to week to week. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
You wanted to talk about money. I heard you say on the other end of this is what do these people do with money? I'm curious what you were thinking about there.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, I mentioned a podcaster I worked with in the past who held a campaign event, right, for a local candidate. And I think this is really common. So the people who are making the most money from podcasts are in rooms supporting candidates who are directly stripping away environmental protections, who are directly causing travel bans and human rights violations for different demographics of people. They're directly stripping back our education system. And the education system in particular particularly grinds my gears because to have built a platform like podcasting, which is an education and information platform, with the intention of disseminating information and ideas, which is the purpose of education, right?
Yeah.
To then strip back with no like fact verification or anything like that, truth measurement, to then go into the education system and to strip back people's education so that they're more likely to believe anything they hear on a podcast, right? And they're not equipped with the media literacy to fact check. So all of these things I think are really related, and let alone the donations that are made to campaigns. So directly helping people get elected who are stripping away human rights and actively causing harm to our environment and to our communities. This is really scary, right? And then there's also the layer which I started to touch on of having candidates on. They've also built this massive platform that's worth a lot of money. So they now have this opportunity to bring on candidates and amplify their voices and ideas and falsehoods, right? And to give them a platform, a bigger platform to cause more harm. And all the people listening to then be persuaded psychologically, because it's a neural pathway. I'm having a dialogue with this person to then go regurgitate that in their daily lives. So the like domino effect of who we are putting money in the pockets of, who these top creators are, what they do with that money is a little terrifying. And I think that, one statistic I found from Edison from last year that's really interesting. So 2025, 40% of people who listen to podcasts identify as Democrats. 23% identify as Republicans, which means there is a 17% gap who don't identify as either. And that means that we have an opportunity for influence among podcast listeners that is tremendous and will determine the outcomes of future elections. So yeah, podcasting is political.
Well, it's so strange because then you look at the top of the charts and it doesn't reflect those numbers. It's
Yeah.
really bizarre. There just hasn't been that kind of voice
That tells you
from
what the power is of that
Yeah.
gap.
money. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
and
the
I think
17% gap, that doesn't identify either way. So if where the money is and where it goes is to what we would consider probably more conservative voices, that is influencing people who don't identify as conservative. They don't think what they're listening to is a political podcast. They think they're learning about business or fitness or whatever, but they are being influenced.
Well, and make no mistake, as consumers, we have some say in what's happening. Yes, there's these algorithmic gods that are back there pulling strings. The gatekeepers are there and they're influenced by money, but they're influenced by money. And if a show suddenly gets major fallout and is not getting listenership, it's not going to get that support that it's been getting. And you will see it
Yeah.
start to go down the charts and someone else will come up. And that's our power, is to not sit by idly and say, yeah, I don't always agree with everything Joe Rogan says, but he's funny, or, he has good guests on sometimes, or
Yeah.
whoever the person is. We can't do that. Like, our decisions they matter. These decisions
Yeah.
matter on what we choose to consume. And I think it's important to think about that because we are part of the system. And while we don't have the power that the people at the top do to control the puppets, we do have a power to say whether we're going to watch those puppets. And if we choose not to, it does make a difference because they're going to be like, we're not putting our money on this one then.
It's also pulling the same support that you're talking about, pulling that support also from the major advertisers. So we saw a mass exodus from Spotify over their continued support of Joe Rogan, right? And let alone a
And
lot of other
ICE,
things.
when they were running ICE ads.
Yes,
Yeah.
and ICE ads, right? Yeah, that's a whole other conversation about advertising. Yeah, I think like pulling, like if you know who the major supporters are, who the major advertisers are of the podcasts that you believe are causing harm, also pulling your support from those advertisers, that's going to send a message as well.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up, I think there's just one question left, and it's like, well, one, thank you for this conversation. Like, this has
This
been
was
very
fun.
good.
Thank you.
But like, what for people listening and watching? Like, what do you want people to walk away thinking about in terms of the political nature, right, of podcasting? Like literal politics, but also just like the power dynamics and the accessibility and hierarchies and things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. And I think, the biggest theme that I'm taking away from this conversation is what you said, Becky, of your choices matter. And so I think as a consumer, as a creator, your choices matter. And I think even just as a consumer, and not to like downplay consumers, but specifically to consumers only, I think also thinking differently when you see everybody talking about how much they can't get over Amy Poehler's podcast or whatever, like thinking about it differently of like, what are we doing when we're, pushing more and more millions of dollars into celebrity podcasts, and how is that affecting like the system, right? And not that I'm coming for Amy Poehler, I don't know her, but
She seems
um
lovely, honestly,
whatever,
but
yeah,
yeah.
I don't know her like that. I'm not trying to come for her, but I'm just saying, like, she is one of those people who would say, "We make no money off this," right? And so, like just changing the way that you think about that. And I would also just, I mean, it'd be remiss to add, because I run a podcast production company for indie creators, that your voice matters, right? And so podcasting is a very low barrier to entry and an opportunity to use your voice and to amplify what you uniquely bring in a way that no other platform can create that level of both intimacy and amplification. And so this is an unparalleled opportunity with a lower barrier to entry than ever before for you to use your voice, because your voice matters. And so, I would love to support anybody who has a podcast, wants to start a podcast in their journey, and to connect that way. I'm trying not to spend as much time on social media. I know you all have did this before me. You made this move back from social media before I did. I've reached to that point. I'm exhausted there too, but I do sometimes still hang out on Instagram and LinkedIn, and those are probably the easiest places to come hang out. But I would love to support the person, to you listening. I would love to support you on whatever your podcast journey looks like, including the podcasts you love listening to the most. Come tell me, and we can help share them to amplify their voice even more.
And we didn't even get into, I'm realizing now, and we don't have to, but video and the push to make podcasting basically into broadcasting and video broadcasting now, and how that changes accessibilities and creating barriers to entry and everything else. So, and again, it's only contributing to the celebrity push and the people who have the
Yeah,
money to make
there's a
great
lot
videos.
of things. Video, I think also the ICE ads you touched on. Also, there's an accessibility, like being an audio platform, the push to add transcripts. There's so many things that unfortunately we did not get to. But yeah,
Well, because I guess the point being, politics touches, again,
everything.
there's politics as in the profession of politics.
Mhm.
And what we're talking about, which is every decision that we make relates inside of these systems in which we exist. And it comes down to everything of like, do I use video or not use video? Do I think about transcripts or do I not? I mean, just like every little piece of this, every decision you make as a creator or a consumer is existing inside of these systems. And
Yeah.
therefore
Oh
it
my
becomes
goodness, those
political
transcripts,
decisions.
is it AI? Is it generative AI? Or is it
Yeah.
human? I mean, every single
Exactly.
decision is layered. It's all complicated. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But
It's
thanks for
messy.
having the discussion with us about it because I mean, again, we can't talk about everything because it's literally everything, but
Mhm.
it was great to just some of these things and to think about. And I hope for people listening, for them to think about just as whether you're a creator and or a consumer of podcasts, to know that this stuff is showing up. Even if you're not a quote unquote political show, you're existing inside of these systems.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And your podcast is Big Brave
Big
Business.
Brave Business. Yeah, you can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts. And yeah, we have conversations like this about business, and that especially all the extra layers of what you were just talking about, of all these decisions you make. And that's really what Big Brave Business is all about. And you'll hear Becky and Taina over there as well, because regular recurring guests.
We'll link to that and PodFox in the show
Thank you
notes
so
or
much.
whatever platform you're consuming, because we do video as well. Because you have to, right? We don't have to, but we choose to. Anyway, thank you, Sarah, so much for being here. Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
Taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.